All right, it looks like we got some people filtering in. Welcome if you're just joining us to our webinar, People Leaders Club of January, on navigating difficult conversations in the workplace. My name is Luke Wiesner. If you haven't met me yet, I am a coach and conflict resolution practitioner. Been doing this kind of work for about 8 or 9 years, mostly in the nonprofit and higher education space. And we have I'm really excited for the conversation we're going to be having today. We have 4 fantastic panelists who I'll introduce you all to in a minute. But first, I want to go over just a little bit of some tech stuff and ground rules for how you might participate in this and what we'll be doing today. First, the session will be recorded. If you're an attendee, you will not be in the recording. This is just for the panelists. And that will be able for you to be able to reference later, also for other members who couldn't make it tonight in the People Leaders Club. Secondly, we're going to be this is a live Q&A. We have some questions queued up for our panelists to respond to. But we also encourage live questions. So if you're coming to this with questions on your mind, feel free to enter those questions in the chat, the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring both the chat and the Q&A, and we'll try to address everyone's questions as they come in. And so this is a great opportunity for you if you have like a particular situation at work or something that you're really needing some advice on. It's a great time to ask some conflict resolution professionals about your situation. So I'm going to go ahead and dive in. I want to introduce you all to our panelists for this conversation. First, we have Alec Chapa. Alec is a conflict resolution professional and coach. Alec works with individuals and organizations across multiple industries, helping them navigate the emotional, spiritual, and strategic dimensions of conflict. Through research, interviews, and coaching, Alec has facilitated successful collaboration and resolution with CEOs, veterans, medical researchers, nonprofits, and academic organizations. Alec has also worked extensively with organizational groups, providing in-depth conflict analysis, developing structural frameworks, and establishing collaboration and community buy-in for key projects and solutions. Alec's conflict resolution research has also appeared in several publications, including Johns Hopkins Maskey Journal. Thank you, Alec, for being here. I don't know if you want to wave so people know who I'm talking to. Thank you, Alec. Really excited that you're here. Next, we have Sara Jeckovich. Sara is a peace builder and currently serves as the process facilitator for Pollack Peacebuilding Systems. She holds a master's degree in peace building and conflict transformation, with a background in trauma-informed care, working with youth and refugees. She is passionate about helping others transform their mindset and find opportunities to grow during times of challenge and controversy. I'm really excited that you're here, Sara. Thanks for joining. And we also have Dr. Sherman Green. Dr. Green is the CEO and executive life coach for Strategic Directions with advanced training in several organizational initiatives. He has worked for over 15 years in the as a higher education professional and as an adjunct professor in the community college and university level. His focus points are strengthening self-awareness, helping clients to be held accountable for their future goals, and equipping clients with the skills and resources that will allow them to complete any life endeavor they want to pursue. He's also a certified trainer in the assessment of People Map, which is designed to help people designed to develop people's skills within companies to build better relationships between employees and help people maximize their potential. So thank you, Dr. Green. Thanks for participating in today's panel. And finally, we have Toni Hawkins. Toni Hawkins is a peace builder that uses the tools of conflict management to guide people through challenges often associated with differences in perspective, backgrounds, opinion, process, and person. She uses curiosity, care, and creativity in the strengths that she brings to the conflict management table. She absolutely loves what she does and is grateful for the opportunity she's entrusted with to help people gain understanding, agreement, enlightenment, perspective, and better relationships. So thank you, Toni, for being here as well. And all of these wonderful folks are peace builders and coaches with Pollack Peacebuilding Systems. So thank you to Pollack Peacebuilding Systems for loaning some great conflict professionals for our panel today. We have a lot of wisdom and experience in the conflict resolution space here today to answer your questions. We did collect some pre-questions before this webinar, so we'll start with one of those. And then again, if you're just joining us, I see a couple of attendees that have started to join. This is a great opportunity for you to ask your questions as well. So please feel free to use the chat box, the Q&A feature, to type in any questions that you have. And we're going to try to get through all the pre-submitted questions and your questions live here today. So to get us started, let's start with, I'm going to throw this over to you, Alec, to get us started. In your experience, and also if you're just joining us as an attendee, this is our conversation is focused on difficult conversations in the workplace and navigating workplace conflict. So Alec, in your experience, what are some best practices for initiating a difficult conversation in the workplace?
Right, thank you, Luke. Great question. I definitely, have my experience, and my approach is really to front load where you can. And it's not always possible, right? Sometimes conflicts come up organically in the moment, sort of that moment, right? But where it's possible, I absolutely recommend, and I've had a lot of experience and success doing it that way, right? So first, I really recommend, to be resolute. If you're going to go into a conflict and initiate a conversation, you really want it to be productive instead of just sort of messy and finding your way around, kind of stumbling in the dark. Be resolute, right? Make the commitment. I'm going to act. I'm going to do the work, ahead of time to process my barriers and things of this sort, so that it can go really well as it can. I also recommend people to, prepare for the conversation, which can include a lot of different, dimensions. But, for me, what I call it is taking a journey from I to we, right? So that basically requires somebody to, kind of set aside time, energy. Maybe, I've had experience doing it with colleagues, where I have them help me, process what are my issues. Maybe it's something that I'm bringing to the table because of past experiences, stressors, things of that sort. Or what is it that's difficult with regard to the workplace itself, or the person that I'm dealing with. Processing that, the lead up, what's at stake, that sort of stuff is absolutely critical in my experience. And then eventually getting to that we component is taking the step of, processing that and understanding it, and then shifting to a strengths-based perspective, right? So you're no longer just thinking about what's tough, what's painful, what you don't want to experience, and you're starting to begin to think about, where the opportunities are, where the transformations can take you. And then, when it finally comes down to that initiation part, include your pilots from the get-go. That's my advice, right? So permission your way in as far as you can. Can I be vulnerable with you? I'd like to have a difficult conversation. Is now a good time? These are the kinds of things that are going to help people to get off to a good start.
That's really interesting. I love the visual of just turning from I to we is really like that. I feel like sums up a lot of what you're sharing, and the emphasis on preparation, I think, is really key too, and helping people understand what to prepare and how to prepare, and not just writing all your grievances down to be able to present to them, but to do that preparation in a productive way. I'm curious to bring in some of the other panelists in to hear your thoughts, your perspectives on what Alex is sharing, or on this question in general of initiating a difficult conversation.
I will go ahead and share. I just want to say thank you, Alec. I really liked where you started with the internal work, because I think that's the most important part, really preparing for initiating a difficult conversation is the internal work, right? What's your motivation for having this conversation, and what are your own biases that might be at play, and kind of asking yourself a lot of those questions prior, I think will help when you're in dialogue. It will help to essentially mitigate risk, right? From a potential back and forth kind of defensiveness and more of that reactionary type of conversation. And then you also talked about, the kind of like the time factor, right? And I think that's also something to take into consideration is, is it an appropriate time for that individual? You talked about an invitation too. So those are things that stand out to me a lot in this preparing for initiating a difficult conversation is the internal work, the time factor, and the invitation, right? Are you asking permission, as Alec kind of stated there? And then of course the I, right? And trying your best to, when you are in dialogue, you are engaging in that conversation, to speak from your own experience and use I statements. And I like your, again, as Luke said, that image of the I to the we. So in dialogue, how does that happen? You might be using I statements and then shifting towards the, like, focusing on the future, right? So how can we move forward to make sure that this, whatever the, the challenge or controversy was that led to the conversation, doesn't happen again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that, Sarah. And that for you, Alec and Sarah both, talking about the preparation, preparing yourself or the I, that I think is so important, because like you spoke to motivation and planning, but I think it's also really important that when you're looking at motivation, that you also prepare yourself for not knowing what the response is going to be. And you have to, you have to be ready for whatever that response may be. And there are things that you can put in place to try to mitigate or to try to pave the way for a more favorable response. Still can't control it. And you have to just be prepared for that,
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you for
absolutely.
bringing that up.
Yeah.
Yeah, just really quickly, thank you for bringing that up. It's a very important dimension of it. Yeah, that is almost a, sort of a catch-22, right? How do you prepare for the unprepared? But knowing that that's coming is absolutely a big part. Yeah, Sharman.
Oh, I was just going to reiterate, and that is so very important. I'm glad that Toni mentioned that, because you have to kind of come prepared to tap into the deepest spaces with some people, and it can trigger them, so much differently than the other people. And so whatever response that you get from them, you have to really be mentally prepared to expect it, because if you don't, then the trust and everything else just kind of falls at the wayside at that point. You have to be equipped with how to handle it when it does happen, because it will. And it's just a matter of just being prepared and knowing that it will happen. So that's what I wanted to chime in to say.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
One thing that Sara mentioned that I think is going to be really of interest to maybe some of the attendees is the degree of risk that can happen from these difficult conversations. And I think if you're an organizational leader or an HR manager or whatever position you occupy, you're always kind of looking at these conflicts through a lens of degrees of risk to the organization, to the team, to the product, to the customers. And I think one thing that's really standing out to me from listening to you all is one way to kind of mitigate risk or reduce risk is spending some time preparing and setting up the conversation to be as supportive as possible, and the things you might do internally to prepare for it, but also things that, how we set up the conversation in terms of, are we having it on the phone? Are we doing it through email? Are we doing it in person or video call? Are we giving them some choice of kind of when we meet or how we meet? Or are we providing an agenda so we're not catching anybody off guard on kind of what's going to be brought up? So there's a lot of different things to be considering, and even just the logistical setting up of the difficult conversations. I'm curious if anybody has any thoughts on that lens of things.
that to me sounds like creating safety, right? So you want to kind of have a safety both in the delivery, the invitation, and the logistical of like how where the conversation takes place and how it does and when it does. That to me just, it sounds like safety, right? In a nutshell.
I agree. And then it also goes to what Alec already said about like time. So, I mean, you don't want to engage in a conversation like that, you know, when that person might be facing a deadline, or if it's the time of day that you know they're going to be very busy or distracted with other things. And if you ask them what would be a good time, then that gives them also some agency in the whole process and some choice. Which can help with the outcome, rather than you know, someone just saying, you know, I need to talk to you right now, or, you know, just, you know, you taking on all the responsibility. Share it and allow the other person to help decide on when and where and how. And there's nothing wrong with saying, can we go to lunch, or can we go take a walk so that we can have this conversation, or can we go downstairs to the coffee shop? There's nothing wrong with removing yourself from the work setting and going to a really nice, pleasant, pleasurable, neutral place, you know, for conversations like this.
And there's like an element to this too of like, you know, there's, you know, the old saying, if you want an idea to be, you know, really picked up and run with, the best way to do that is to have other people think that they came up with the idea. And so it's almost like, because they have ownership over it, and so they're going to follow through with it. So if you can help people have ownership over the conversation, even if it's just in giving them some authority over how it's being set up, they now have a little bit of buy-in in having that conversation go well. Any other? I mean, this is a really interesting conversation, and we don't have any follow-up questions yet from our attendees, but feel free to throw some up if you're listening. But we do have some follow-up questions from our pre-questions that I think gel with this conversation. But before we move on, I'm wondering if anybody wants to add, if we covered everything so far, or if anybody has anything they want to add before we transition.
This is potentially a question too to pose to the other panelists, but when we're talking about the invitation, right, to the person that you were wanting to engage with, I'm wondering if it's also in certain situations important to declare the reason. So you inviting someone to, yes, engage in a difficult conversation, you know, but about what, you know, so giving them a little bit, you know, Luke, you had mentioned sort of the not catching the individual off guard, right? You don't want to necessarily kind of surprise them of this invitation. So declaring the reason why, you know, what the purpose is, I think is important. I don't know. What do you all think?
Well, I definitely think that's absolutely important to think about. You know, one thing that I find myself, you know, one piece of advice that I found to be especially helpful is, you know, say the quiet part out loud, right? All the time, you know, I have this experience, and I've talked to other people, they have this experience where, you know, it's like, well, that's not what I meant. What I meant was, or what I was trying to do was, right? And that part, if you just create a runway for people and you go, just say that, it goes amazingly well. You see the difference in night and day. And if I'm understanding you right, sir, this is exactly what you're talking about, right? So, you know, I see this problem, or it seems to me that there is a problem here. There's some kind of difficulty, you know, and am I right about that? Okay, great. Well, if we're both seeing that, then here's my intention. I'd like to create a space where, and that I want to, you know, something to that effect, you know, helps create that runway. Yeah.
That's a great kind of imagery, Alec. I like the way that you're framing that. I find that too. Like when I'm coaching somebody and they say, I have this thing that I need to tell them, but I just don't know how. Like, can you give me some advice? And I just say, well, what do you want them to know? And then they tell me, I'm like, that sounded perfect. Like if you don't get caught up too much, and oftentimes what's in here is the way that is what's going to. But if you filter that through some preparation, you're probably good to go. And I don't know, this kind of brings me to like kind of a little bit of what Toni was sharing too of you can't necessarily, there's some unexpected things. You should be prepared for unexpected things that come up, but that also includes for ourselves too, and our own reactions, whether you start feeling defensive or aggravated during a conversation. So I'm curious on what might be some good things for us to consider for those unexpected things to occur for us personally in those conversations that maybe we're not expecting. And I don't know if Toni, if you want to get us started with this one.
Sure. Because it's inevitable. I mean, there are going to be unexpected things and there are going to be challenges, and even just the unknown can cause us to feel anxious. And so if you compound that with reactions from, the people we're trying to communicate with, and those reactions that might cause us to feel, defensive or, like you said, aggravated, things like that, it can make it even harder to communicate your intention. And so one of the things that I think is really important is it's kind of like what we've already said. It's like preparation. So going into these conversations, knowing, okay, this could happen, that could happen, but also preparing, like you all are talking about, like you said, what did you say? Say it out loud, or say the quiet loud. So I'm a big yes of like writing it out, like write and then saying it out loud, and then write it again and say it out loud until it sounds right to you. Then when you get to that best place where you think, okay, this is clear, it's good, this is what I'm trying to convey, and I feel like it's at a point where they should be able to receive this. Then being able to do it, and then saying, okay, but if they don't, then, and they lash back out or they say this, I'm gonna be prepared already. And some of those things I think we can do to prepare is just becoming like more self-aware. So aware of certain words that tend to trigger you or that tend to bother you, of certain tones of voice that people might use, of certain body language that might, kind of tip you off. And so if you know those things ahead of time, then you can help to control yourself if they become present in those meetings. And, we talk about like threats, so, our bodies, our autonomic nervous system responds to threats or perceived threats. And so, someone raises their voice, we could perceive that as threatening. Certain language, rolling of eyes, looking away, all those kinds of things that people do when they're in uncomfortable conversations. If you're a part of that, you can react negatively to that. But one of the ways to mitigate it is to be prepared. And so knowing the words, knowing the actions, those things that can cause you to go off. And then in the moment, like stop. And stop it's a verb meaning to literally stop, but it's also an acronym that's used a lot in mindfulness trainings and things like that. And we actually do it in some of the trainings that we do with Pollack Peacebuilding. But so the S is for literally stop. And I don't mean like get up and walk out of the conversation or walk out the room. I'm not saying literally stop, but on the inside, just stop. Try to stop your brain for a moment. And then the T, take a breath. So I'm a big advocate for paying attention to your breathing, and especially in stressful situations. I get a lot of practice at it, but just breathing. And you don't have to like know how to do it. You don't have to be good at yoga or anything like that, but we all breathe. So you know, in that moment when someone is saying something or their tone or whatever is such that you're like, okay, I don't like this. This doesn't feel good to me. Breathe. And like the breathing I do is very simple. I will start and I'm still maintaining eye contact with the person because I'm still engaged, but I start breathing and counting to myself. So I'll inhale and count to 4 to myself. I don't do it out loud. Then I'll exhale, not in a way that they can see what I'm doing, but in a way that is helping me to become more centered and more calm. So that one, I'm paying attention to my own responses and I'm calming myself so that I don't react, so that I can respond in a way that is not gonna deter me from my goal, which is communicating. And then the O, so the T was take breaths. The O is observe. Like, what am I really feeling? Am I feeling threatened? Is it weird? Am I feeling like they're not listening to me? What am I feeling? And that goes beyond just like, do you feel threatened or unheard or disrespected? But like physically, what am I feeling? I tend to get a tightness in my stomach in moments like that. I'm like, I sweat, which is, you know, it can be unattractive, but I mean, you know, but I can sweat. Sometimes you'll feel a tension in your head. And if it wouldn't happen with any of you, but if we happened to be engaged in a conversation that kind of took a turn for the worse, if you see my head tilt to the side and this eye kind of narrow a little bit, those are physical things that I've noticed that I do when I don't like what someone is saying or how they're saying it. So like I have become more aware of my body in those moments. And it helps me to be able to manage it. And so that's what I encourage people to do. Think about past experiences where you were in a challenging conversation and you were beginning to feel disrespected, unheard, those kinds of things, and what was going on with you. How did your stomach feel? Did your heart start racing? Were you having like short, shallow breaths? Think about all those things so that when it starts to happen the next time, you're like, okay, I've experienced this. I know what this is, but I can self-manage and I can breathe and I can calm myself down. I can de-escalate myself so that I can continue this conversation. And so that's kind of the O, is observing. And the observing is yourself. And then the P is then proceeding. And so, I mean, you might decide I want to proceed with this because I am going to successfully manage myself. Or you might decide, you know, I'm going to proceed out of this conversation so that we can resume it later. Either way, it's okay. But the key to it is self-awareness and self-management. And you have to practice. And I am still practicing. I'm still working at it. So
I love what you were sharing there, Toni, and I put, because I think that's a really good tool to stop. So I put it in the chat for people if they missed what one of the acronyms meant. But and we'll talk a little bit about avoiding, I think, here in a minute. But I think it's important to distinguish the difference between creating space between you getting defensive or aggravated, between creating space and avoiding. And it's okay to create that space, even if it's for an hour or a day or a week, if that's what's needed and appropriate. But it's like having that defined sense of here's when we come back to the conversation, which makes it not avoiding. If you just say, hey, you know, I need to leave the conversation, but there isn't a bookend of when we're coming back, then it's easy to just avoid it and have it get lost and then build up again. And this comes back to, again, which I think is what a lot of leaders are thinking about is risk. And when you're feeling those feelings that you were talking about, Toni, what we know about that is you're less likely to use your prefrontal cortex, which is going to lead to you doing something that's going to maybe potentially create more risk for you in the organization. So there's a lot of value in creating that space, but not avoiding the situation. So thanks for sharing that, Toni. I'm curious, Sherman, Alex, Sara, anything that is coming to your mind with this?
Well, I think you really hit it on the head, Toni, as far as the procedure that needs to take place, because we all know that when we get to a certain place and we get a response from someone that really triggers us, it's really easy for us to go off our emotions, how we feel at that moment, and really, like you said, just make the situation much worse than what it really is. And that is something that everybody's going to have to practice on, because like you said, I mean, I'm practicing on that myself. I think I'm better at it, but I think I still have some ways to go, because I have gestures in me as well that are very much evident, like, okay, you just really ticked me off just there. So I'm really having to rein in my face to not let that be shown. But it's something that we all really have to really practice on, because as professionals, we want to always let people know that they can trust us and they can ensure in us that we're going to give them the best advice or give them the best guidance possible. And I'll also say this, just in working with students in higher education, and individuals that I coach on an individual level, is something that, you know, I think it's more like your bio responses. Like when your bio responses are going off, then, you know, it's really up to you as to how you react to that moment. So in those individual spaces that I have, they're being aware of what they've done wrong, and the next time that it comes along, that they're able to handle it a lot differently. And I think that that's a very life learned lesson, because we're gonna all face some type of conflict, and we're all gonna face something that we just have a problem with, and we all have to work with that and work on it. So I'm definitely a work in progress, but you know, I have my moments.
Yeah, we should add another P to the stop. Stop, take a breath, observe, proceed, practice.
Right.
And do it again. Alex, Sara, is there anything that you wanted to add to the discussion that hasn't been mentioned yet?
I just want to emphasize, Luke, you began to touch on it, is that kind of after you go through stop, as Toni introduced to us, you know, that self-awareness, that you're knowing your triggers, you're self-regulating, 2 of the 4 pillars of emotional intelligence. And I think of what Luke began to touch on is knowing that, you know, the P part, right? Proceeding, it might be asking to continue this conversation another time, because you're feeling triggered, you're aroused, you're not going to be able to touch into the prefrontal cortex and think logically and constructively, you know, continue throughout that conversation. So being able, and that's really that's a strong ability to self-regulate or self-manage, is knowing when you're triggered and knowing, hey, in order to proceed, I have to take a break. I'm feeling this way right now, so do you think we can pick this up at a later time? I need some time to cool down. You know, I just encourage leaders out and anyone out there to, when you recognize in a conversation that you are feeling defensive, you are feeling aggravated, you're triggered, right? Then it's okay to ask to continue at another time. That actually shows strong leadership, if you're able to know and do that.
Which is maybe hard to hear maybe not hard to hear, but maybe goes against what are all these great qualities that make leaders, which is you have to make quick decisions. You have a lot on your plate. You're seeing all these things, and this conversation is just a line item on your long agenda for the day. So giving yourself some permission to not have to make a decision when it's, you know, potentially going to be the wrong decision or not the right time to make a decision. Alec, anything that you wanted to add to the conversation?
Yeah, no, this is all really great content, and let me see if I can sort of lace some of this together. Yeah, I definitely, I mean, the STOP is a great acronym, and I love the idea of the extra P, Luke, because practice, you know, there's a phrase that's going around: awareness builds choice, but practice builds capacity. And I think that is so fundamental, at least for me, to remember, almost like a mantra. because, it is so easy to sort of, look at the glass half empty sometimes, and had a tough day and, everything looks like it's got a gray cloud, right? But maintaining that perspective, is just so helpful to come back and say, okay, well, it's something that everyone has to practice. Becoming aware and self-regulating is super important, and I'm getting better at it. I'm going to have better days. I'm going to have days where I'm not so good, right? The other thing is, Toni, and you were talking about this a lot, just the bodily dimension of conflict, right? This is also very important for me to remember that, it's okay to, right, do that internal work in the process of that conversation as it's happening. So just the take a breath part, right? Super important. And then communicating the intent, right? I'm still listening. This is just very hard for me, so I'm going to do this, but I am listening to you, right? Saying that quiet part out loud, doing that bodily work at the same time, and then just saying, let's go ahead and talk about this in a day if that's all right with you. There's that permission in part. And I mean, there you go, right? You're communicating the intent to say, I do want to talk, but I think maybe for you, but at least for me, this is a lot right now, So yeah, really good stuff. And yeah, I think overall just maintaining that bodily dimension is super important.
Mhm. I agree. And one thing you said, Luke, and when you're speaking particularly to leaders, I think it is excellent to model this humanity if you're a leader. Like to model that, to let people know that yes, I might be the CEO or the boss or whatever, but in this moment, this is something that I need to do because it's best for me and it's best for us. And I think that that's how you start building that culture where people then can engage in these sorts of difficult conversations and things. It's when it's modeled from the top down rather, excuse me. And so it can't be perfect, because if it's perfect, then everyone else will be afraid to try it.
Getting this kind of vision, and then I want to transition a little bit, but of kind of like this like ebb and flow of almost like emotional just emotions in a conversation or escalation in a conversation that can happen during these challenging and difficult topics, where for both you and the other person, there's needs to be some sort of awareness of kind of when things are getting too high to where it's going to continue to be productive, and giving yourself permission to not only for yourself to take a break, but also respect that when other people need to take a break, even though you want to drive the agenda and get something done, if you're noticing the other person needs to maybe use the STOP acronym to maybe take a break because you're noticing someone else might actually need that as well, even if you're okay to move forward. Which so far we've talked a lot about kind of like us in the conversation, how we prepare, how we kind of navigate our own escalation in a difficult situation. But I'm curious to kind of turn the lens a little bit to other people and how we communicate to other people specifically. And Sherman, I'm going to be interested in hearing your thoughts on this, maybe to get us started. But when people are, and this happens all the time in a workplace, right, where you're with people, but people are avoiding the situation. So like, how do I get them to come to the table? There isn't that buy-in to want to have the difficult conversation. I want to have the difficult conversation, but it's hard for me to get them there. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, Sherman, and then we can open it up. But you got any thoughts on this? You got any tips for leaders who are maybe working with folks that are maybe avoiding situations?
Oh, absolutely. I have had a lot of conversations with people who try to avoid things, and I'll take a little of the guidance that I usually get from watching Judge Judy. And the thing I love about Judge Judy is that she is a straight shooter. She does not like hold back on what she wants to say. Now, there are things that she says that I can't say because I'm not a judge and I don't have that show. But I think as it relates to people who try to avoid, you have to be straight with them and say, okay, it's apparent that you are avoiding this topic. And once you present that to them, you allow for them to be exposed. And when they are exposed for avoiding, their whole countenance is going to change at that point. And then once you have them to realize that, okay, they've seen me, they've seen what I've been doing, they are exposing me for the avoidance that I'm giving, then you ask them, okay, there is a root cause to this avoidance. Why is that? What is going on? What is so touchy or emotional about this particular issue that is making you avoid the topic at hand? Let's talk about whatever that is. And I want to hear from you exactly what has gotten you to this place where you are constantly avoiding and hiding from this thing. And that's not something that comes easy for some people. Some people really struggle with saying those two things. You are avoiding this situation. What is the root cause behind this? I think that it's always helped me to have these conversations with people because I've been able to build a rapport with them. I've been able to be familiar with them so that I can talk to them and have the availability to do so. But I also have seen it when I haven't had that rapport with people and I've been able to ask them and they've been able to open up to me what those things are that's allowing for them to avoid the situation. And then after that, we bond because they've been able to expose something that's very vulnerable for them. And they have been able to talk about it in a space that's safe and is non-biased and is going to give you the feedback and the guidance that's going to help you to move past this thing that you've been avoiding. And so when the process works, when the barriers have been broken down, it really just lifts a lot of weight off of that person's shoulders because they realize that what they have been struggling to talk about, what they've been running from, it really wasn't that big of a deal in the first place. There have been so many barriers that made it seem as though it was, but once you face it straightforward in a straightforward capacity, and you talk it out with somebody who's actually wanting to know what the issues are, it's really not that bad. So for any leader that is struggling with this particular avoidance issue with anybody, just be a straight shooter. Say, hey, you are obviously avoiding this situation. And then ask why. What is the root cause of you avoiding this? And watch the walls fall at that point. I've had several conversations with other employees who, kind of face the same type of situations with employees. And when I've told them to do this, they'll come back and say, I don't know why I just didn't do that, but I don't know. I just didn't feel like I could do that. But, we all could do that. We do it every day with friends and talking with people that we love. We are really always doing this, but for whatever reason in the workplace or anything that's outside the workplace, we feel like we can't do it. But it's a very powerful, I think, process. And I've had a lot of success with it. I would love to hear some other ways in which my colleagues here handle this situation, but that is seeming to be a very successful way that I've been fortunate to use it.
That I think that can absolutely work with a lot of people. I guess one thing though is that we all have different communication styles and we actually have different conflict styles. And if you're the person that is needing to communicate with someone and they're avoiding it, I think another good approach is to approach it from a needs base. To start the conversation, like I need to talk to you. I have some feelings that I need to be able to share. And so that you're saying it's about you. And it doesn't sound like you're accusing them or attacking them or calling them out, but really approaching it from something that you need. And then asking if they're open to hearing like what your needs are and then exploring ways they might be able to help you meet those needs. Because it might take some of the pressure off of them. Because and the other thing is, and as coaches, we all know this, everybody just doesn't have the tools. And that's why, sometimes you need us because we can help. We can help you, whether you're the person avoiding or the person that is needing to speak to someone avoid. We can help you build towards being able to have that conversation in a way that is safe and rewarding.
That's I really love what the two of you are sharing here, because there's like, it's almost like there's this not like two different, I think what the two of you are saying are in ways very similar, but also maybe work with different people, and depending on your relationships, and there's like this, like Sherman, what you were saying of like being curious and like, okay, if somebody's avoiding something, what are they protecting, or what's going on underneath there? Because oftentimes when people are avoiding something, it's probably because they're protecting something, or there's something going on that isn't really about what that thing is. So what are they protecting, and trying to get curious and ask why? And then Toni, what you're talking about is like taking the pressure off of like, it's not on you, because this person may feel a lot of pressure to respond or not, know how to engage. So taking kind of a more of an I approach, a need approach, to kind of take that pressure off. Like, I think you could do both of those things in combination and have it be pretty powerful. But one thing that you said, Sherman, that I had never thought of before, which I think is really interesting, is connecting with people on something different. Like the conflict doesn't need to be resolved on that issue. It can be resolved through building relationship through other things. And then maybe there create some openings to actually bring up the things that you need to talk about. So I love that, of like thinking about, okay, well, maybe I'll take this person out to lunch to just talk about something else, just because that's going to help build that bridge for us to get to that conversation. I think that's very insightful. Sara, I see you're unmuted. What do you got?
Yeah, I'm just thinking, listening to you both, and really this question in itself is a difficult conversation, right? Essentially, that's what someone is avoiding a situation, and so what you're all describing is giving feedback, right? And that is the difficult conversation, is giving that feedback. So it's all kind of coming together, and I'm thinking about some of the initial things that we talked about as far as preparing for it, right? And so taking all of that into consideration when someone, a colleague, a direct report, a supervisor is avoiding a situation, prepare yourself to give that feedback, right? And however you decide to go about it, whether it is kind of through more of the I statements, or it's through, hey, let's get together and go to lunch and talk about something different, and and gently sort of build that trust and rapport in order to identify the other situation that's being avoided, right? There's as Luke sort of just pointed out, there's different ways of doing it, but they can also be done at the same time. And essentially what we're talking about is giving feedback, having a difficult conversation that takes preparation and time and emotional energy. That's it.
For sure. And I like, Sara, that you were kind of bringing in some of our past conversation to this of it's all related to how you approach this, both for us, both for other people, the situation, how we set things up. Just out of curiosity, Alec, I want you to have a chance to weigh in if you have something to add before we move on to this other lens that we can explore. But is there anything that you want to add to the conversation, Alec?
Sure. I'm glad that, Toni, you brought up the conflict styles, the approaching styles, because I mean, absolutely, what all three of you are saying, and Luke, you as well, it all fits in some situation with people, just any combination of these things. And one more that I would add is, accommodating, right? That tends to be my style. So I sort of see where people are. I'm glad that you brought up the bridge metaphor too, because I get the visual that bridges are great to build where you can, and this is not to say that there are some bridges that you can't build. It's just to say that sometimes building that bridge requires a certain lens of almost equity, right? Where you begin to say, well, this person is almost on another level, quite literally, right? So they need to sort of build up, maybe it's a skill set, something to this effect, but we need to level the playing field, so to speak, before we can begin to build that bridge. And for me, that takes the shape of accommodating. So when it comes to leaders, I think that it's not always the best thing to do, but it absolutely can work. And I highly recommend it for individuals, employees that are especially nervous or that make it defensive, coming to their level and then working back outward from there. It works wonders in my experience.
You're bringing up, Alec, the power conversation in an organizational hierarchy, and who has the formal power, who has the habitual power of who's been here, 15 years versus the 6-month employee. And I don't know, maybe we can kind of open that a little bit. And I'm curious on your all's thoughts on how power dynamics take shape in these difficult conversations, especially from a leadership role, both because for leaders, it's not just having the difficult conversations, it's also supporting others in having the difficult conversations. So you as a leader don't have to be in all the difficult conversations. You have people who can do that themselves. But any thoughts on how power shows up in this dynamic, to kind of build off of what Alec was sharing? And Alec, you feel free to jump back into.
Well, sure. I mean, power is, I mean, especially in an organizational setting, whether there is a very strict hierarchy and, you're talking about a Fortune 500 company, and those hierarchies are very, very important for scale and all these things, or you're talking about a cooperative, right? Either way, you still have power dynamics that are at play. These are, it's very important to remember that workplaces are constructed. They only exist because people establish those systems, those rules. And so anything that we create is to some degree intentional, and we can change it, right? So, back to that capacity, right, and awareness. First becoming aware, okay, we then have a choice. Then as we build up, our skill set, right, like we were talking at the beginning of this conversation, but then helping others, maybe through PPS services, or through any of these other team building exercises, the skill sets of others, that's where we can begin to actually create capacity, and then, bridge that power gap, so that people feel that they can actually have a place in the conversation, and it's not just doing lip service, Yeah.
Yeah, and I like the bridge metaphor too. And I think one thing when I talk about power with leaders is a lot of it can sometimes feel like you don't, like, well, if I give people too much, like there's a reason why there's hierarchy a lot of the times, right? There needs to be some sort of decision making. There needs to be ownership and accountability structures that are set up. But helping people find their own power, even if you hold a formal power position of, like, because I can imagine people maybe avoiding situations because, and I've worked with a lot of teams where whatever, if it's historical organizational trauma or historical conflict that have shown up, that kind of just makes people kind of just throw their hands up of saying, I'm here, I'm going to do my job, but I'm not going above and beyond. I'm not going to go out of my way to connect with colleagues or participate in this committee or whatever it is that are maybe that kind of above and beyond type of thing. Helping people find out, like, connect with the power that they have in that position of, like, when you do these things, you create this impact. Without you doing this, these things wouldn't happen. And there's a source of power within that people can tap into, that isn't not only power, but it's empowering as well. And it empowers people to kind of take more of a proactive and approach on some of these things. So that might be another way to kind of, it's almost like that bridge, like it'd be weird to drive across a bridge that was like this, but to balance it doesn't mean you have to bring, your side down. You can help bring other sides up, so that you can drive across it. So that's an interesting kind of dialogue that we could probably continue for another hour if we wanted to, about power. Any other thoughts on power before we switch to kind of more culture, organizational culture type things?
I'm thinking, just to kind of go off of and in alignment with what you both are discussing right now about power, is it sounds like psychological safety, and that is built through leadership, being able to show some humility and create the type of environment that welcomes continuous conversations and curiosity, and embodying what you want others to do. As a leader, that will help, as Luke points out with the image, that will help create that more level playing field, so to say, especially in regards to navigating conflict and having these difficult conversations. So if a leader, someone higher up on the chain of command is creating, I know we're going to be talking about culture, but creating that type of culture that is safe to be who you are and say what you feel, all of that, then that in turn, as Luke says, will empower the others to do that as well. So that will help with the power imbalances when navigating conflict.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So like Luke, you spoke of that person that doesn't want to take the extra step and doesn't want to do more than maybe what's required, and you mentioned it earlier when you said that they're protecting something, or they could be they're avoiding to protect something, and it could be they're protecting their feelings or their perceived dignity, or that in the past they felt disrespected when they tried to step out and do something, or they were shot down, or maybe criticized, or maybe nothing happened to them, but they witnessed things happen to other people when they tried to do that. And so they are, a lot of times, like you just said, Sara, with regards to psychological safety and protecting, those basic psychological needs. You protect yourself sometimes by just, being silent, by avoiding taking chances, by avoiding conversations, even avoiding being seen, by stepping out or stepping up. And so, yeah, in those cases, then people don't feel, the only power they feel is that power that they feel in the moment to protect themselves. But then that's an organization that's not growing because people aren't giving their best. And the type of leadership you need is such that you're giving everyone what they need to do and be and produce their best. And they have to feel safe in order to do that. And that type of leader has to have a certain vulnerability, which is a word we hadn't really talked much about yet, but I think it's really important.
And saying no and withdrawing is a form of safety. Like if you don't feel safe engaging or saying yes or getting involved, your choice to feel safe is to say no or to withdraw. So that could be a sign that people are looking for safety somewhere else if they're not finding it within your team. That if you notice kind of a culture of withdrawal or avoiding. I appreciate you bringing that up, Toni. And so we've kind of been jumping around, from the different vantage points of kind of maybe initiating the conversation or us going into the difficult conversation, the dynamics, the other people involved, but we've kind of touched on this idea of the culture of conflict within an organization that I think leaders set the tone for what that is, or maybe they don't create it themselves, but they have a heavier weight of what that culture is. And so I don't know, Sara, if you want to jump in on this and give me your thoughts on what you think of how, particularly for the leaders who might be watching this or people in a management type of role, how, what are some ideas of how to kind of create that culture that allows for that safety for people to deal with these types of conversations in a healthy way?
Yeah, thank you, Luke. I mean, as we have touched on already, it's about embodying, right, what you want the culture to look like, and it does stem from leadership, and so I mentioned briefly about psychological safety, and a big part of that is creating the type of environment, right, where people feel safe messing up, and you're able to show some humility, and as Toni mentioned, vulnerability. And if a leader is embodying it and illustrating that to their team members, their direct reports, it's going to create more of that psychological safety and that empowerment for the rest of the team, those direct reports of yours, to do the same. So, what does that mean, right? We've touched on briefly the kind of two pillars of emotional intelligence: self-awareness and self-management or self-regulation. It's a huge part of it. Practicing active listening, empathy. Are you? And this is kind of getting into those other two pillars of emotional intelligence, of social awareness, right? What's going on around you? Are you able to pick up on some cues when you see certain, this department isn't really communicating well with this department, or this individual seems to withdraw a little bit when we're in team meetings? What's going on? Are you noticing those things? And that fourth pillar of social or relational management or regulation. Are you acting when you see said behavior and inviting the conversation, whether it's this difficult conversation or just a general check-in? Are you practicing inclusivity, right? That's a big part of that social regulation. Is are you and psychological safety to that extent, right? In terms of, do your team members, do your colleagues feel safe in this environment to be who they are and mess up and not have to fear a negative repercussion of something based on an opinion they have or an idea for a new project? Do they feel safe to speak up without necessarily something coming back to bite them in the behind, or however you want to frame it? So I think that that's really important for these leaders to embody and create in this culture of psychological safety and being able to constructively navigate conflict. So enhancing your skills as an individual, yes, emotional intelligence. Well, what else, right? Because it's not just on that. I think there are other kind of best practices that help enhance those, and those are regular ongoing communication check-ins. Like, do you have one-on-ones and on a regular basis with your direct reports? Do you have some type of feedback mechanism in place if you don't have those one-on-one regular check-ins? Is there a way to give and receive that feedback? And that aligns with the inclusivity and transparency, right, within the culture, the team. And then I also think that we run into this a lot with our work, where folks, team members, are kind of like, oh, well, we don't know what to do when this happens. We don't know, what is our conflict protocol, right? When something I'm having, maybe it's not as extreme to where you feel, for some larger organizations and companies out there where you have an HR team, maybe it's not that big of a deal, so to say, to where you're going to go to HR. So who do you go to first, right? And what is the first step? I think that's important for leaders to, if you don't already have it, create one and with your team, and do so in an inclusive and transparent way. What's everyone comfortable with? What is the first step? And that's going to look different depending on the size of the team, the capacity that everyone has. Yeah, so I think it's like building this culture is, just to kind of summarize my thoughts here, is it's a combination of creating the psychological safety and embodying the type of leader, that you want your team to illustrate, match, while also having clear expectations and sort of guidelines as far as a conflict protocol.
Yeah, it's that expectations that are, that I think is really standing out of kind of what you were sharing of do I know where to go when this happens? Do I know how to give feedback on this to my superior or my colleague? Do I know what is expected of me on a Zoom call, whether I need to have my video on or not? Because if I put my video on, but a colleague, if someone on my team doesn't, then I'm starting to spin my stories about why they're not doing it. They're not participating in the same way that I am. So I'm going to turn my camera off. And those like little things, those little unmet expectations that seem benign, they grow over time. We spend, 40 to 60 hours a week with our colleagues, and those little things accumulate and grow and they snowball. And so finding mechanisms to kind of catch those things early, have clear expectations so people know where their role is and how to operate with each other. I think those are great things that you're sharing there, Sara. So I appreciate that. I'm curious to kind of bring in Toni, Sherman, and Alec to this too, and see what your all's thoughts are on how leaders and supervisors might help create that culture where conflict can be dealt with efficiently, timely, and in a healthy way.
So I think, I don't remember if it was you, Sara, or you, Luke, that said it. Like, you could be the leader and there may not have been a culture that dealt well with conflict, but it can be. So if you're striving towards it and wanting it, that's good too. I think there's so much benefit in asking people, talking to your peers, talking to people that are in the industry, and just asking questions. How do I do this? What does this look like? Can you name some organizations that are doing this really well? Looking at employee satisfaction surveys across industries, and then going and talking to those people whose people aren't leaving, who aren't quitting, and who are happy there, and asking to speak with their culture. And now, like, that's a whole new job, is people in culture positions and things like that. But like, what are you doing and how does this look? Because I want the people that are working in my organization to be just as happy or happier than yours. And so being open, which, it can be hard for people in leadership positions sometimes to be vulnerable to say, I don't know. But I think that that's a strength, to be able to say, I don't know and I need help, and going to the places where you can get that help. But I mean, that's what I certainly would advocate, is to ask and learn, like take a class, take a training, go to school and learn, so that you can take what you get and bring it back into your organization.
And if I can just add to that, Toni, before Sherman jumps in, is sometimes the answer is actually in-house. You're just asking the wrong people. There's so many HR and organizations, they do exit interviews, but they don't ever interview the people that are staying. And why are you staying? What are we offering? What about this culture that is keeping you here? We usually interview the people that are leaving us, and we want to know why. And then those files get lost somewhere, usually, and don't get acted upon. But you have people who are staying, and why are they staying? You might even be able to interview people in your own house. Go ahead, Sherman.
Yeah, I was just gonna tag along on some of the things that Toni just said. And I think you said this earlier. I mean, it's easy for leaders not to come across as being human. And I think one of the things that's lost in translation is a lot of leaders just don't take the time to get to know their employees. They don't get to know their direct reports, because they want to be on this pedestal and they want to dictate. They want to have this sense of authority and power. But I think the strongest leaders are the ones that actually are human and get to know their people. Because if you want to create a certain culture, it starts with you. So it starts with having those conversations, getting to know them, just on a one-on-one basis, talking about them. how was your weekend? Tell me about your family. You know, what's important to you? I think when that type of culture is created, it creates this place where you're able to go and talk about the most uncomfortable situations or the most conflictive situations, that it's not something that you have to think about at that point. I mean, by this point, maybe 3-4 months in, if you've gotten an indicator that your leader supports you, he wants to get to know you. When you have a conversation with you, he listens. He's not just talking at you. He or she's gonna feel more comfortable coming to you if something is conflictive, because they know that in other conversations they've been respected and they've been valued. So those type of human things go so far when it relates to creating a culture. And that's one of the main things that I harp on when I'm talking to other individuals who are wanting to have a culture where they feel like they can have an open door policy. So it really just goes to my knowledge of just being a human and having conversations and building rapport with your people to create that culture that you want.
And I just want to highlight something that Sherman, you and Sara were mentioning about listening, and Toni, I think you brought this up too, of listening. And I think one of the things, and I've coached a lot of leaders who've run into this. Well, I am listening, but there's still these problems. And I always ask, like, well, what are you doing about it after you listen to them? And they said, well, I haven't done anything with it. So it's not just listening; it's also you have to listen up, but you also have to follow up as well. Right. So okay, I've heard what you're saying, and here's how I'm implementing it, or thanks for your feedback, but I needed to go a different direction. Even if you got to tell them that you're not going with what they're with what they're telling you, having that so they know that their opinions are in your thought process is going to help them feel that psychological safety to then speak up next time without you asking. So I think that's, especially for leaders, an important aspect of it is if you want them to speak up, you not only need to listen up, but you need to follow up as well. Alec, is there anything that you want to add to the conversation to kind of building a culture of effective conflict resolution?
Sure. I mean, where do I come in? I mean, this is all such great content. I'm really noticing that for me, what I'm perceiving is that there's two almost camps here, right? There's what we're putting in, and there's what we're taking in. As far as what we're taking in, of course, we want to be listening. And I heard somebody once, a coach, conflict coach, talking about, listening with our ears, listening with our minds, and listening with our hearts. And if we're not doing all three, we are not listening, right? Right, because for one thing, if you're listening with your mind, I mean, it's very important, problem solving, what's the solution here? But somebody could feel, well, that was my idea, right? So it's important to honor that relationship, right? That person's, right, their psychological needs, that safety. So, a little bit about that. But as far as what we're putting into the world, for me, what I'm seeing here is a lot of emphasis on questions. Now, I absolutely agree with you, Toni, that it is a stellar quality of a leader to be able to not only admit that they don't know something, but to actually be able to shift a culture to maybe not center around questions, but at least to celebrate them wherever they come up and wherever they're constructive. As a matter of fact, I think that there are questions which are perennial in nature. Not every question is, right? What time is it? Well, okay, that's only true for a minute, right? Where are we? Where's my cell phone? These things, right? But questions such as, what in life can we value, which at the end of our lives, can we know, the worth of our lives through, right? What values are instrumental for that? Any of these questions are questions that we want to actually keep for the course of years or decades, right? The relationship that we have to technology or to any of these things. So when a leader can in some way access those and create a realm for others to access them through, that's a talent, I would say. And when we're able to do that as leaders, we do allow that psychological safety, because we're showing people, well, as a leader, I don't know everything. Come join me in this, right? So there's that joint problem solving. And hopefully, these people are in their roles and they're using their talents according to those roles so that people can help answer these questions collectively and put their best through answering that question, right? So that's a little bit about what I see as far as putting in and taking in to create a good, healthy organization.
I love that. I feel like we could extend this conversation by another hour. There's so many questions I want to ask you, Alec, about what you just talked about there. But unfortunately, we have time constraints on this call. But maybe I might have to pick your brain about that later. What I want to do is we're running close to at the end of our time. So I'm going to ask you all to think of just one word. Like if you could just, you can be loose with it if you want, but a quick thing that you could offer the people watching this or the attendees today that could sum up our entire conversation. And obviously you all have decades and decades of experience working in conflict. So if you could distill that down to like, here is the takeaway that I want to offer you. It could just be a word, it could be a phrase, whatever it is, just to be able to offer to the attendees and the people watching this after today. So I'll give you a second to think about that. And I want to thank the attendees that showed up today. I hope you got some things out of it. And I hope to see you next week at our coaching call. And if you're watching this after the fact, I mean, you're curious more about People Leaders Club, you can go to peopleleaders.club. We offer a 30-day free trial to check us out. And you can participate in these types of calls on a weekly basis with other professionals in other fields and other industries, as well as group coaching sessions and trainings. So thank you all. And I also want to thank Pollack Peacebuilding Systems, Toni, Sherman, Alec, Sara, for participating in this and giving your time to offer some really great insights. But I want you all to leave the people with one more insight before we go. So I won't call on anyone. I'll kind of just whoever's feeling moved to give your final takeaway. Feel free to share.
Well, I'll go ahead, Toni.
I say this to people I'm working with. I say it to my family, and I say it to myself. Is like the more we learn, then the more we're responsible for. And so we don't want to just talk about it. We got to be about it. And it's a process.
Love that. Love that. I always come back to this. Continue to see the best in others, because that is what others have done for you to get you to this point. So continue to see the best in others and do the inward work of processing whatever you need to process in order to show up for people that way.
I'll say we're all a work in progress.
Humility, curiosity, and continuity.
Love it. Yeah. Do you see it? You all just distilled like decades of experience into like 3 minutes. So I hope people can appreciate that. And thank you all again for showing up and offering your wisdom and experience. And I'm sure we'll have some other times to pick your brain in the future. So thank you all. And for the attendees, we'll see you next week, hopefully. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.